that they needed this failure. And this is about David Cronenberg's film Butterfly, which was a film he made in the early 90s following his film of William Burroughs' Naked Lunch. And it was his big failure because this film came between Naked Lunch and Crash. Crash was his return to the indie world and was very controversial. It was very David Cronenberg, even though it was an adaptation of a J.G. Ballard story. But it was kind of the switch of Cronenberg from being someone who could make films within the studio and someone who was pretty much independently minded. This was the big kind of changeover film, really. And it was hated on release. It got terrible reviews. It was like pretty much viewed as a failure. It was viewed as ridiculous, boring, and that's not what we want from Cronenberg. I mean, they let him away with Dead Ringers because it was so good, because it was talky, but it was so good. Naked Lunch, well, because of monsters. This one was the film that people just had was like, no, we don't want this. So what actually happened there was Cronenberg kept making Cronenberg films, but this was a film that was the specific changeover, and I think it was a case of he just moved where he wanted to move anyway and didn't really pay attention, or he paid attention, but I think it was a case of this was the film where he realised he couldn't really be making studio films, big studio films, like other directors from the 80s and horror were trying to do. I mean, John Carpenter was still doing studio films, George Romero was still kind of indie studio film, same with Wes Craven. We're still trying to make films that were genre specific, that would get funding. This is where Cronenberg seemed to realise that the films that he really wanted to make were not studio films. This was like the very definition, because this was a studio film. This was David Geffen produced it and financed it. It was released through Warner Brothers. It was a big studio film that made no money. That was just destroyed critically and commercially. It just was like no one was interested. I mean, specifically, it was destroyed critically so badly that it couldn't really move on to get some audience interest. I mean, when they started filming it, the Crying Game came out. Well, I'm not sure they're filming it or before they released it, but the Crying Game came out before this film could get released. So it was a similar project, a similar setup of a trans subject that the mainstream had never dealt with before in a way that wasn't a comedy, and these were like dramas about it. And this was the second one in line after Crying Game. And the Crying Game was based in a lot of ways on a surprise. No one knew that the character that you thought was female was actually male. No one knew that for a big chunk of the film, so the surprise was there. And when it went into this film, they expected the surprise to be there again, which is ridiculous because it pretty much tells you from the outset, the fact it's based on a historical fact, the fact that the premise you can't avoid telling you what it's about. There's no way you could do that surprise. And the film completely wasn't even interested in doing that surprise. That was the big thing. They were not really interested in doing a Crying Game twist. So it got kind of damaged by that, because they were saying, well, John Lowen, who plays the trans character, is obviously a man. And, how could the Jim Reynolds character be surprised, be fooled by this? And they're saying the film's ridiculous because it takes this premise and says, alright, he could be fooled by this, therefore we can't take this film seriously, therefore it's a complete failure as a film. And that was the simplistic view that they took of this film on release, because they said the character is meant to not know as a woman, the woman was a man, so because we could tell, we can't take this seriously. So it was a very simplistic one view of the film, as it did not live up to our thriller ideas of what the film should be, when the film itself actually wasn't a thriller. It pretty much knew that you should know that it's a guy. It pretty much is set up from the start. And it's a act of like self-denial, and it's an act of psychology. But people didn't get it. The people couldn't see that you can see the film as a guy fooling himself. No, you had to surprise us, even though we all knew already. And it was like, so something is not a surprise, you want to be a surprise. That's stupid. And the intelligent thing of, I could tell it was a man, because one, you're looking for it to be a man, and two, you're looking for it to make sense of what I would do, or how I could see. But in fact, it's about a character who is blinding himself to reality, and it's that psychology. And that's the psychology Cronenberg moved forward with from this film. It's like a private psychology. It was something that was in his earlier films, in the more obviously sci-fi movies. But it's something that was going to become very dominant. You see the Spider, you see Crash, the psychology becomes dominant of what someone's seen, why is it different from reality, why is it a private reality that is slowly being revealed. So you look at History of Violence as about a guy who isn't who he says he is, but it's really, the story's not about the twist, the story's about us understanding what the psychology behind him actually is, and what weird psychology he has created for himself. Which is the same thing that happens in Eastern Promises. It's another one about a guy who's not who he says he is, but it's all about the psychology of the guy, not the twist. So this is something that Cronenberg started really in Dead Ringers and Naked Lunch, which was this. Both of them had characters who were trying to redefine a place in life and aren't quite sure themselves. But this was the one that it was pretty much, this is all it's about. There's no special effects. There's no weird thing about twins that you might not have a different view on. Because it was, no one really understands twins that much. They've got their own fantasies about twins. But for some reason they understand trans so much. I mean, they obviously don't. And it just became this kind of weird thing of them not, them seeing it, and them wanting something obvious to hang on to. Because this was not a crime game where it was all about twists. This is about the psychology of someone who's attracted to someone who's presenting with a lie, but it's a lie that you need some psychological damage in yourself to actually not see through. So that's the film. The film's about how we see the world, how we lie to ourselves to see the world, how does that affect our development as people, and how much damage does it do to that person if you're always lying to yourself, and lying to each other. And it's about lots of things, lots of assumptions. So most of the stuff the film was about, because it wasn't a twist, got, the film got thrown away basically. It was Cronenberg's big failure, Then he came back with Crash, and that was a big controversy. Then he did The Existence, which no one understood because it wasn't The Matrix. Then in the 2000s, it was almost like people had got an idea of what a new Cronenberg film was, but had taken these other films to cement it like he wasn't doing the same film anymore. He was doing something else, but he was not really working that much with the studios. Some of these films were financed by studios, but they were the indie lines of the studios, or they were like History of Violence was financed by New Line, who'd been doing Lord of the Rings, but they'd done a lot of indie films. They were still doing a lot of indie films at the same time. So it was that kind of arm that he was working with mostly. Always working with Jeremy Thomas and doing all these pre-sale stuff for Dangerous Method or Cosmopolis, which I'm not sure was Jeremy Thomas or not. But he was doing lots of these films that were hard to get financed and were difficult financing, really. But he became much more interested in the worlds we create and the worlds that we don't understand. So when Eastern Promises of the Russian mafia and the Russian world in London, which no one understood, in History of Violence, is someone from the violent-ridden big cities suddenly going to a small town, and how does that affect them? But it's the after effect of it all, and it's about have to have been there for a while, and the old life comes back. And Spider, it's about Tom and trying to come to terms with reality, and his own reality, his own history, which has always been perverted by his psychological damage. In this one, it's actually about a character who falls in love with his own fantasy. That's what it's about. I mean, it's about the idea of the French in China, these diplomats in China that have a fantasy of what China actually is. And in lots of different ways, because they live there, they're all in different ways, finding ways to be part of society. Some of them get into the drinks and drugs of a situation. They go down into these like places you really shouldn't be going if you're a diplomat. Other ones try and say they're still French and they're pure French, and I'm keeping a distance from this. And Guillemard, played by Jim Rounds, is someone who thinks himself as he's an accountant, but he thinks himself as more artistic and more knowing, and when really he's very uncomfortable with his place in the world. So he meets I can't remember the name of the lead character, but who he calls his butterfly, and it's from the start he's fantasizing who this person actually is rather than the person themselves. So this is the ultimate look at what we see in a person rather than what the person actually is. This is the ultimate version of this, because it's like as John Lone says later on, he goes, only a man knows what another man really wants. It's like he knows that because he's a guy, he knows what this other guy desires, his kind of weird kinks, because he understands as a very male view of femininity and the desires and the wants and the realities that of women that guys might not like. So they'd rather have the fantasy version of it. So it's a pretty much it's an indictment of male fantasy of what women should be, because every time there's a actual woman in the film who sees a situation, it's like, oh, for Christ's sake, what the fuck, what the hell, it's like, and it's just this feeling of there's all these communist women who are watching all this thinking this is decadent nonsense. And the whole idea is the Chinese are a society that's moving into communism because they're sick of capitalist, insanity and capitalist self-indulgence. So they're going purely the other way. So it's two extremes fighting each other, two ways of saying this is how life should be. One being communist because they've been so destroyed by capitalism and their emperors and stuff like that. So everyone should be equal, and it's almost psychopathic because it's like everyone should be equal. So no artists, no doubt, no nothing. No one, like artistry is a kind of decadence in their view. Like self-introspection is a kind of decadence. So Guillemard is the exact example of decadence. Because he's a Western guy who is indulging in this weird fantasy, and he's willing to sell his state secrets, to keep it going. And it's about much does he know, much does he not know. It's pretty much is like he doesn't really care. It's just secrets to him. He's really addicted to his own fantasy, so he's really addicted to his ideal of what he wants from his life. So he invents a China in his head, and it's played along with by John Lone's character of she is telling him stuff that invents all these old Chinese sayings that Iron buys into because he doesn't know any better and he doesn't want to research anything. He'd rather just have the fantasy of he knows better. It's a bit like we see online now of anyone has done about a week of research into culture. They suddenly know everything about the culture, and it's like, no, you don't. You really don't. You don't know half the nuances. You don't know why one thing led to another, led to another. You really don't. And this guy, Jay Man's character, is a fantasist who doesn't understand he's a fantasist. He doesn't understand his own weaknesses. He indulges in them. He thinks himself respectable and cultured, but he's not. He gets everything wrong about the war because he doesn't understand the reality of the war and the wants of the people actually want, which is to take away all the enchanted idea at that time is it's post-revolution. They're going to go to the most extreme version of it at this point. They want it to be an example of taking away all the poisonous attitudes that oppressed them for centuries. He doesn't get that. He doesn't get the... he's gone through his thrill of discovery, and they have, in a country behind them, is doing their own version of that via communism, and he doesn't recognise it. Because he doesn't recognise himself. He doesn't recognise his fantasies are all tied into this art and all this. It's basically about how art can be destructive to someone if they can't understand the reality of what they are and what it means to them. So what does art mean to somebody? And if you've got a weak mind, it can mean something that it really doesn't, and you can get caught up in it. And that's what's happening. But it's also a look at basically discomfort of trans reality, which is like, obviously this character John Lone plays is trans, but because he's a character plays as a woman in the opera world, who then actually caught up in that lie because she liked this identity, and has created this identity, and the other identity, the real person, doesn't feel is real to them. So they're caught up in this because of the system that is going. It's an old-fashioned worldview. It's not very progressive, and it's going much more regressive because of the cultural change going on. So there's no escape for this character to actually develop an identity that's healthy for them, because it's just the cultural backdrop for them isn't healthy for them to actually experiment and actually figure out what they actually are. And also, because Cronenberg is tied up to the French system, he can't actually, because he's the oppressor whose fantasies are all infecting this relationship, he can't actually get told off in a proper way that will actually make his fantasy more realistic and make it much more about focusing on what he actually desires. Because what he desires is something that's not catered for in a normal relationship, or not normal relationship, a heterosexual relationship. It's not really working for him. But because he's in this no man's land of political intrigue and lies, and how he's become a pawn in this system of East versus West, he can't figure it out either. He can't be like slapped in the face and told to grow up a little bit. He just follows this romantic fantasy of his own that's utterly ridiculous, because he's not facing the truth of the situation. He's not facing what his needs actually are, which is what the film's about, rather than the big surprise. But people want the big surprise, and that's the kind of problem with the film. For people watching it, it's always, you want the big surprise, and it's not about that. It's about denial, and it's about what you actually want and what you tell yourself you want, and how a complicated physical reality can get warped by the outside world, which we see all the time. We've seen history for centuries. Like, anybody who's a bit different from the mainstream gets castigated out, and they have to deny who they are, and they can't really evolve into something healthy. That's changing now, hopefully, but it's been there for a long time. And this film's about that. But people didn't understand it because they wanted the surprise. And the surprise, it's not about the surprise. It's actually, if it was a surprise, it would probably be less in the film, because it's actually about the idea of denial and the idea of what you deny in your head, what you actually, the reality versus what everyone else is seeing. The reality in your head is different from what people are seeing. And it's about that dynamic. whether it's political or personal or sexual. It's about that dynamic of not seeing what's in front of you and fantasizing about it and making it up to be something different than it is, and so you can't actually face what the desires are and actually try and face it in a kind of sane way. So, Jim Mounds, towards the end, his character gets so involved with the Chinese culture and is so nostalgic towards something that never actually existed, but from his own head, that he becomes just this weirdo. And ultimately, he kills himself at the end because he feels he's been betrayed. And the thing is, he dresses up as Man Butterfly in his big theatrical suicide thing at the end. Well, he's the one who betrayed himself ultimately. He's the one who did himself in. But he's not willing to face that. He can't face the consequences of what he actually did. He can't face the reality of the things he was doing and why people supposedly oppressed him. It was like, well, the other character, the John Lone character, got oppressed a lot more by the Chinese system and by what they wanted from him than Jim Mounds ever did until the end. And it was like, there was a manipulation, but it was a manipulation where both sides get damaged, and one person, the John Lone character, actually becomes more sympathetic in a weird way because he's aware of the trap he's in, and he can't quite mutate it to whatever he needs to be. Jim Mounds' character is trapped in romantic nonsense. So it becomes a story also of a couple where one person's so romantic and so fantastical that it kind of ruins the relationship because they can't really face reality. And it causes problems, it causes an ability for a relationship to actually mature in any way. And it's about how society influences that, plus also the characters themselves influence that. So you're not seeing someone the way they are, you're seeing them the way you want them to be. So it's a film about relationships and a film about how politics is involved, but it's also a film about how your own fantasies can actually do you in if you're not careful. And it is a film about trends and traditional views of sexuality versus a view that's much more understanding that there's different ways to be. So it's a wonderful film. It's really underrated. It deserves to be seen a lot more because I think nowadays it's more understandable what it is about. It's about self-deceptions and the various levels of self-deception. It's not about the twist. So I hope you enjoyed this video. You know, I hope you look at this as the start of something Cronenberg needed to expel himself from the try to do this big studio thing like The Fly to actually go and do his own thing. You know, because this is really the start of the second part of Cronenberg's career. Now, of course, it started with a failure, but it was needed. So I'll be back soon with another video, but that's me for now.